Have you ever wondered if it's okay to EQ GarageBand drums? Well, in this video, I'm going to explain why you often should EQ your GarageBand drums for them to sound as good as possible, and show you how to take your GarageBand drums from this to this. Crazy, right? It's like we pulled a blanket off of those drums. They went from dull and muddy to huge and clear. That's the power of EQ. That's the only difference between those two things is EQ. And in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I did that so you can do that with your drums. Welcome back to the Band Guide, where we use GarageBand to create professional sounding music. I'm your band guy, Colin, and before we jump into EQ and drums, I want to let you know I've put together something to help you with EQ. I put together a completely free EQ cheat sheet that just breaks down EQ and explains it a little bit better so that you can better understand it and start to better use it to create professional sounding music. There's a link in the description below. It's completely free. It will help you understand what we're doing in this video a little bit better. So be sure to grab that. And as we're starting to talk about EQ and drums, I want to have in the back of our minds that drums are one instrument. Ultimately, they're in the real world, when we're not working with samples, they're all together. And so there's a lot of bleed, there's a lot of overlap, and they're always treated to some extent, yes, as multiple parts, but a sum of all those parts. And so even though we're going to be zeroing in on a kick drum and zeroing in on a snare at points in this video, we want to always be thinking of them in terms of the entire drum kit. It's really, really important that we're not losing that focus. And more importantly than even that they're one part within a larger mix. So while we're going to be focusing on the drums in this video, we're not really going to be looking at in the context of the mix just for example purposes. These drums still exist in a mix. So as I'm making all these decisions when I'm working on this, I am thinking in terms of how does this sound in the mix? And you should be going back and forth between solo and in the context of the mix to make sure that everything is sounding good in the context of the mix. Don't spend all of your time in solo. It's going to be really hard to make everything fit together if you're only ever in solo. Now, the other thing I'll just mention up top is when we're working with EQ, we're always thinking about three things: minimizing the bad, highlighting the good, and making space for every source. So as I'm going through in these examples, be paying attention to when am I minimizing things that I'm trying to get rid of. It's not bad frequencies, it's just things that aren't working on that source. When am I highlighting things that are good? What stands out to me? What am I trying to bring out? And how am I making space for different things with EQ so that there's more separation and more definition in this mix? Okay, let's dive in. All right, so I've set up these drums following the Make GarageBand Drums Sound Real and multi-track approaches kind of put together. If you haven't seen those videos, be sure to check them out. I'll link to them above in a playlist so you can just check them all out in one place. It's really going to help you just get the most out of GarageBand Drummer. So let's go ahead and listen to how these are sounding as they are right now. Not bad, right? It sounds pretty good. The kick's just a little mid-rangey for me. I will say that it's important that you choose the drum samples that you want first, right? You have gone through your drum sounds like the SoCal kit. In this case, I'm using the Brooklyn kit. Try out different drum sounds first before you really start moving into doing the Make GarageBand Drum Sound Real step, and before you really start to mix anything. Make sure you have the sounds that you want. As long as you're close, then you can use EQ to get it a lot closer to where you want it to be, to make it really sound amazing. So in this case, it's not exactly the way I want the kick to sound, but it's close. So I know that I can make it sound the way that I want it to with the samples that are already in this drum kit. The biggest thing I'm going for here is just more definition and separation between the drums so I can hear everything super, super well and nothing's getting in the way of each other. Okay, let's listen to what this sounds like with EQ on. Pretty different, right? You can definitely hear there's more separation. Everything's just a little bit clearer, a little more present. It's sounding pretty good already. So let's start with this kick drum. The kick is a really core part of a recording. It's really central to the drum sound and the mix sound as a whole. Let's listen to what this kick is sounding like without EQ. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off everything except the kick and the overhead. So, and I'm actually going to bypass the EQ and the overheads for now. So right now we're just listening to the kick and overheads no EQ. Turn these off as well, of course. All right, so now we're listening to just the kick and overheads without EQ. Sounds pretty good, but again, it's really mid-rangey, right? So let's see what we did with this EQ to make that better. So here's that EQ. Let's listen to it with just that EQ on. It's kind of crazy. Okay, so these are really extreme boosts and cuts. If you've been following this channel, you know I typically don't do boosts and cuts with EQ more than 3 to 6 decibels. But in this case, it just needed this. I tried less at first. It didn't sound like I wanted it to, so I scaled it back up. And so here's what we ended up with. Now, the first thing I'm doing is I'm cutting out this mid-range. If I boost that, it's just super papery. It doesn't really add to the kick in the way that I want it to. So I'm cutting out about 15 decibels of that sound. I think I actually did about 16, a little bit wider. So that's a huge cut. That's making a big difference and just kind of tightening up the kick sound. And then I'm doing a really big boost up here, 13 decibels in this upper range. So without that, it just didn't really have that beater sound, right? That clickiness that sometimes just helps your kick cut through in a mix. So I'm really bringing a lot more of that out, and then a little bit of a bump down at the low end, but not a lot, and just a little bit of a cut down here to make sure there's nothing excessive. And then because I'm cutting so much here, even though I'm adding a lot up here, it still was a little bit lower in volume, so I'm boosting a little bit of volume on the output gain just to get it back up to where it should be. So that's huge. That's the biggest thing that I did in this mix for sure. And that changes the way that kick sounds fundamentally. It sounds totally different. So that is the kick sound. I'm pretty happy with it overall. We'll see if I might scale it back in the final mix, but right now that's where it is. And then with this snare drum here. So let's look at the snare drum. So I'll go ahead and bypass this so we can hear the snare drum without and then with. Just a little more crack, right? It has crack up here. These are the upper frequencies. So if we're focusing more on just the snare, if we go to this frequency here is like that crack on that snare drum, and we just have a small little boost up here, decent size, about 3 decibels, and then a little bit higher, even about 4 decibels, just a shelf up at the top. I'm cutting out everything below here with a high pass filter. With the sample, you don't necessarily have to do this. Samples are already cleaned up, so you usually don't have any sort of information down there. By the time you get a sample, it's already been processed by whoever recorded it to make it sound as good as possible. But they just wanted to make it sound really generally good. You still have to cater it to your mix, and that's what we're doing here. I went ahead and did a high pass filter kind of out of habit, but also just to make sure that there's nothing in there that might be getting in the way of anything else and making space for every source. And then I wanted to boost around the fundamental. The fundamental is the lowest tone of a source, and in this case, it's the body of the snare. I want to make sure that that fundamental kind of cuts through a little bit more. So that's what this is right here. So again, this is a little bit more of a reasonable, it's about 4 decibel boost. Just a nice wide boost to make sure that it's nice and even, sounds natural. Adds a lot, but it's nothing crazy. Let's jump up here to these overheads. The overheads are our overall drum sound in our mix, right? This is where we get all the cymbals and the overall sound. We're blending the sound of the directional mics, the kick and the snare and the toms, with the overheads and the rooms to create kind of a natural sound. This overhead doesn't need as much of the fundamental of the snare or the low end of the kick drum, because I'm going to be getting those from the low end of the kick drum and the fundamental on the individual snare mic. So in this case, I actually wanted to do a little bit less. So let's listen to this without the EQ on, and then with the EQ on. So it's really bright now, right? It definitely has a lot more brightness, which is going to add to the overall definition of the sound. And then I've cut out the fundamental, not cut it out completely, but I've limited it a fair amount, about 7 decibels it looks like. And then I ended up doing a little bit of a boost down here, kind of above where the kick is, the sub frequencies, but just to help this kick cut through a little bit more in this, at those frequencies there. So without that, it just wasn't quite cutting through even to the snare. So I just wanted to sound a little bit more balanced with the snare. Very, very simple. And then I have a low pass on here that's just cutting a little bit of the high frequencies so they don't extend on forever. You don't always have to do that. Sometimes it's worth doing. In this case, I put it on. I felt like it helped just clean up the top end a little bit. And then I did a high pass filter here, and that is to cut into this kick drum some. So without that, the kick drum is extending into sub frequencies. And that's not necessarily a realistic image. When you're thinking overheads, they're over the drum kit, and they often aren't getting a lot of sub-frequency information from a kick drum. They can get some, but as opposed to leaving that in, I went ahead and just cut that out. That's gonna let that kick drum have all that space in the mix to really shine through in those frequencies. So that's the overheads. Let's go ahead and turn the kick and snare back on. And then we have these tom mics. Now I'll go up to this beginning part here, or the end of this phrase here, where it's a lot more toms. I swear. So these toms here are just adding the body, right? These are the directional mics that are being balanced with these overheads. So I'll turn this overhead back on. We're getting a fair amount of tom sound in these overheads. We're getting the definition out of them. So when you're listening to everything together, you know, it's adding a lot right there. All we're really doing with these tom mics is cutting out where they might extend into kind of the sub frequencies and start getting in the way of the kick drum, and then doing boosts where it's helpful to them if needed. In this case, I wanted to bring up just a little bit more around some of the ranges, like let's see, on this high tom around 200 hertz, I felt like that high tom cut through well there. And then with this lower tom, this floor tom, around about 150 hertz. That seemed to be where that drum was really singing, and it's not getting down into the kick drum. Since they're hitting on the same beat a lot, I didn't necessarily want to emphasize that. I left some of it in, but I didn't want to emphasize that. And then cutting around here. So if we listen to this tom, again, it's just kind of a papery frequency. Cut a little bit of that out there. We're still getting some of it from the overheads. So we still have the definition from those drums, and I just cut out anything that wasn't helping. So very nice, very simple, right? Okay, so that is all of our main drum sounds. So we end up with this, and then we have this room mic here. Now with this room mic, there's two things going on with this in terms of EQ. The first one is that EQ can also help add distance to something. So before it even hits the reverb, I have this high pass on, or high cut, this high shelf, to help it sound a little further away. If you've gone through EQ Expert, you know about this. If things are a little bit darker, then we perceive them as being further away. And since room mics are meant to be further away than close mics and overheads, I want it to sound further away. So it's a subtle difference, but it definitely adds. And then I cut a little bit of the low end out just to, again, make space for that kick drum. And then I have a second EQ after the reverb to kind of balance it a little bit more, tuck everything in, get rid of the low end that was extending down below here. If you're listening in good headphones, you can hear this. Listen close. It's a subtle difference, but it definitely cleans it up a little bit and lets it sit better with everything else. And then parallel compression here. I'll bring this up a little bit in volume. With parallel compression, the big thing I was going for is just to tighten it up in general. And so the low end overall, we're not really doing anything. But if you're listening in good headphones or on good speakers, again, you're gonna hear that just extends down forever into the sub frequencies. So all I did was a high pass to just cut that out. And it still is getting some nice low end that's adding to the low end of the kick, but it's letting the sub frequencies be just a little bit cleaner. Same thing again with this crunch. So crunch, we have a little bit right there that's just cleaning it up before it gets in, and that's it. So again, it's nothing crazy, right? But it adds up. And it allows you to take something that's muffled and lacks definition like this and make it into something that is full and has clarity and separation like this. And that's all with EQ. EQ is the only thing we're using here. So should you use EQ on GarageBand drums? Yeah, probably. You probably need it in your mix to make it sound as good as possible. Now, that doesn't mean EQ everything. You don't have to EQ everything, but EQ what needs to be EQ'd. Listen and decide, do I want this snare to cut through a little bit more? Do I want this kick to have more click like we did in this video? What do you want your source to sound like, and then go for it. Now, if you don't already have it, be sure to grab my free EQ cheat sheet from the link in the description below. It'll really help you out, and it's completely free. And if you're interested in really going deep with EQ and really unlocking its potential to be able to start doing this in your mixes, I've put together an entire course called EQ Expert, and I just reopened it this week, and through tomorrow at midnight, it's 20% off. So be sure to grab that if you're interested. This course is insane. It's called EQ Expert, and it will make you into an EQ expert. It gives you all the behind-the-scenes information you need to know, the stuff you just have to learn in a very interesting way. I try to make it fun and engaging. And then it takes you into how you need to EQ and the exact process that I follow with every single thing that I EQ to get the best results possible. It's extremely clear, it's extremely easy to understand, and people are getting insane results with it already. I've heard some mixes from my students already, and the difference from before they were in the course to after is unbelievable. Again, it's 20% off through tomorrow, so be sure to head over. There's a link in the description for that as well. It'll really help you out if you're interested in that. But if not, be sure to grab that free EQ cheat sheet either way. And before we go, I always like to finish with a question for you. And this week I want to know, do you EQ your GarageBand drums? Let me know in the comments below. If this video is helpful, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next week with another video.
One thing at a time, I can